Finished up our sermon series that we were doing for the entire months of January and half of February. The sermon series entitled, What is a Healthy Church? And we really talked through the 6 areas of a healthy church and what it means for us to be healthy individuals in a healthy church. Well, this week we're going to transition into a new sermon series. And this new sermon series is entitled, A Rescue Story. So for the next 6 weeks, we're going to be going together, and we're going to be going through as a church together the book of Exodus, which if you're not familiar with where that is, it's the second book in the Bible, second book of the Old Testament. And so if you start at the very beginning, you get to Genesis. The next book you're going to run into is Exodus. And we're going to be looking at this Old Testament story, this narrative of how God interceded, how He acted on behalf of the Israelite nation in the first 20 chapters of Exodus. But not only how did God rescue them, but how is He rescuing us today in our own lives? The same God that rescued the Israelites, the same God that interceded on their behalf and worked on their behalf in terms of bestowing upon the Egyptians plagues. The same God who did miraculous wonders in the desert. The same God who parted the Red Sea. The same God who gave His people the 10 Commandments. The same God who worked in a relationship with His people. It's the same God who is working in our lives today. And that's what we're going to be looking at the next 6 weeks, culminating in Easter. And on Easter is going to be the greatest rescue story ever told. In the way that Christ rescued us. And the way that He provided the means for us to be saved. And we're going to be unpacking that and looking at what was the Old Testament view of this salvation. How did God work then? And then also, what are those principles that transcend time and they continue to work in our lives today? Now, when I look at our church today, and I look at our culture, and I look at America, and I look at the world, we are a people who need rescued. Every single one of us is a person who needs rescued. We are people who need rescued from the boring and from the base. We are a people who need rescued from the exciting and from the ecstatic, from the mundane and the monotonous, from the schedules and from the shows and from this lethargic life that we lead. But in terms of us being rescued, there has to be 2 parts to that equation. If we are to be rescued, there has to be a rescuer. And if there is a rescuer, that means that there are some people who need rescued. And some of you here this morning, when you're listening to this, and as we're going to be unpacking this book of Exodus, you may be thinking to yourselves, I don't even know that I need rescued. Jay, I don't think you understand. I'm okay right now. Everything's going smooth in my life. I got a great job. I got a great family. I got some money in savings. I'm okay, Jay. I don't need rescuing. And some of you, I talk with you. And I meet with you. And I have coffee with you. And I go out to eat with you. As you can see, most of it's done over food when you meet with me. But when I meet with you and I hear you just crying out, and I know that you need rescue, I know that you need saved. Some of you know that you need saved, you just don't care. Or maybe it hasn't made that leap over from knowing to actually acting upon that information that you've been given. No matter where you're at in this equation, if you're at the place where you don't know that you need rescued, or you may know and you want to be rescued, no matter where you're at in that whole continuum, in that whole equation, right now, even without your knowing, God is in the process of rescuing you. Right now, in your life, through your life, and all around you, God is rescuing. He is in the rescuing business. He's in the saving business. And whether you have never been in a relationship with Jesus Christ, or whether you've been in a relationship with Him for 50 years, He still is in the process of rescuing. He's still in the process of saving you. In the Old Testament, if you split the Bible, there's two testaments. There's the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we're going to be looking at the Old Testament over the next 6 weeks. We'll see in the very, very beginning in the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that God is at work in a nation, His chosen people, called the Israelites. And this nation of Israel is birthed into being by God. And this nation, it's founded, its beginning person that God spoke to at the very beginning, his name was Abraham. And in Genesis chapter 12, God begins to speak to this man named Abraham. And so we read in Genesis chapter 12, in verse 2, it said, God speaking to Abraham, and he says, and I, God, will make you, Abraham, into a great nation. And I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So the Lord made this promise. The Lord made this covenant with Abraham and said, you are going to be the father of many nations. That you are going to be the head of this huge, massive family. Eventually, he tells them it's going to be greater than the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. And so God says, Abraham, in you am I going to make this great nation. So he takes Abraham from this place, and he says, I want you to take everything that you know, everything that you've done, your job, your family, everything, and I want you to move them to the land that I'm going to show you. And this land, when you go to it, I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to give you everything. This promised land, this land named Canaan, which is in the modern day place right around where Israel is right now, God leads Abraham and his entire family to this spot. Now, in order for Abraham to have this great nation, in order for them to come through his line, he has to have a son, right, to carry on the family name. So God grants and he gives to Abraham and to his wife Sarah. Even in their old age, Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90 years old. So just a little bit older than most of you and I. A little bit past the rearing age. And they have a child and they name him Isaac. And when Sarah delivers Isaac, she actually laughs when she hears about it. So they call his name Isaac, which means laughter in the Hebrew. And so Isaac, he's raised up, and then he has a wife, and her name's Rebekah, and then they have a son, well, one of their sons named Jacob. And so Jacob is the father, and he has 12 sons. And so you see God, what he started in Abraham, that promise of, I'm going to make you into a great nation. And then he had his son Isaac, and then Jacob has this really big family. And the Lord is just continuing to bless and honor this family that started 2 generations back with Jacob's grandfather, Abraham. Well, at this time in the land of Canaan, there was a famine. There was no food. People weren't able to grow anything. There was no, basically, sustenance for life at all in this land. For 7 years, there was a famine. And that's hard for us to understand. Because we get our food from China. We get our food from South America. We get our food from here in America. We get our food from all over the world. So if one area of the world is hurt or is hit by this famine or something attacks the crops, our prices may raise in some of these other areas. But we don't understand what it means. Literally, there was no food in this whole area. And so God provides the way for Jacob and his entire family to go down to Egypt. Because in Egypt, Jacob's son Joseph has already gone ahead. And Joseph is down there through some divine providence and through some working. That Joseph is already there. And so Jacob is leading his family down to Egypt where they have plenty. Where they have an abundance of food. So he wants to take care of his family, so he moves them down there. And on their way down there, Jacob and his family, they have church. They set up an altar. And they worship God. And it is during this worship that God appears before Jacob. And in Genesis 46, God appears to him. In the same way that God spoke to Jacob's grandfather Abraham, God speaks to him. And in Genesis 46 it says, in verses 3 and 4, then he, meaning God, said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you a great nation. The same promise that he had made to his grandfather, to Abraham. He said, I will make you into a great nation. Now he's reaffirming in Jacob, I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. So here in this verse, in chapter 46 of Genesis, at the very end of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, we have God appearing before Jacob and saying, I'm going to make 3 promises to you. The first one is one of emphasis. I already made this promise to you and your family. I am going to bless you, and you're going to become a great nation. So Jacob's like, I've heard this before, but thank you for reminding me of this, okay? The second one is that God says, go down to Egypt. And while you are there, I'm going to make you into a great nation. But then I'm going to take you as a great nation, I'm going to lead you back to this land of Canaan, to this promised land, the one that I gave to your grandfather Abraham, to your father Isaac. I will lead you back. And then the third promise, it says that his son Joseph would close his eyes. That Jacob knew that when he was down there with his family, that he was going to pass away. Well, when we just read this and we skim over and say, okay, well, Jacob's going to die and Joseph's going to be there. What this meant was the fact that Jacob was going to be in comfort. Jacob was going to be in peace. He was going to be surrounded by all of his family, and he was going to die peacefully. At the hand, not at the hand of, but with his son in his son's hand. His son's not going to kill him. Let me back up a second. His son's not going to kill him. His son is going to be there. All of his sons and all of his family are going to be around him. And they're going to close his eyes. So now what we need to do, when we get into the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, all of this has come to pass. Except for the second promise. So when we skip forward a generation, Jacob has died. His son Joseph did not kill him, but he closed his eyes. Okay? That's come to pass. Also, the first promise has come true, that God has made them into a great nation, and they're huge, and they multiply, and they're doing very well as the Israelite nation. And then, when we read the first couple of verses of Exodus chapter 1, beginning at verse 1, we also see that Joseph, Jacob's son, and that entire generation had passed away as well. Let's read Exodus chapter 1, verse 1. And it says, I believe we have this, and it says, good. These are the names of the sons of Israel, also of Jacob. Israel and Jacob are the same person. Israel, who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. So these are all of the sons that Jacob had. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. All of the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already down in Egypt. Then Joseph died. So Jacob in that generation died. Then Joseph died. And all of his brothers in all of that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and greatly increased. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So that first promise, all the way back in Genesis 46, that God would make him into a great nation, he's done that. That third promise, and the fact that Jacob would die and his son Joseph would be there, that happened. God did lead them down there, and he was with them the first half of that second promise. But all of Israel, they were still down in Egypt. The second half of that second promise hasn't come to pass yet. And so because it's been generation after generation, you can easily see how the Israelites could become complacent. They could become apathetic. That they could become discouraged because they say, hey, I know that God promised that to Jacob. And I know that he promised that to Joseph. But that was like 70 years ago. That was like 80 years ago. We live in a time where it is easy for us to forget our past. When you look at our lives today, where do we live? You hear it all the time. We live in the now. We live in the present. We look for what's that next excitement, that next exciting thing. What's that next big sense of euphoria that I can give to myself? The Israelites were at that same place where they were looking for what's that next thing, but they had forgotten what God had promised them. And so it's easy to see how in our own lives that we could get that same place that the Israelites were. As time went on, and as generations passed, the Israelites, they began to doubt that God would ever do what He had said that He would do in their lives. In our own lives, it's the exact same thing. We begin to doubt. And doubt enters into our lives, and it creeps in slowly. It's not like you're doing really well with God, and then you wake up one morning and be like, all right, man, today I'm going to doubt God. How does Satan work his lies into our lives? He does it slowly. He does it one small step at a time. He does it through one event, one situation, where all of a sudden you look back and say, man, I thought I was doing really well. But now, look how far away I am from God. And it started just in a little bit, just a little deviation. A little deviation. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then one morning you wake up and you say, I'm nowhere near where I need to be in my life with God. And so as that doubt starts to creep into our lives, and we don't see God actively working in our lives, we begin to think, man, in order for me to have this happen, I'm going to have to start doing some things on my own. In order for me to get that next job, that next raise at work, I'm going to have to do it on my own. In order for me to get ahead in this life, I know that God promised, He said He's going to take care of me. And I know I don't have any money in the bank right now, so I know that I need to do something in order to take care of my family. And you begin not to trust God. And that doubt creeps in. You say, I need to pull myself up on my own bootstraps. That's the only way that I'm going to get ahead in this life, is by the effort and the work that I do on my own. And again, that's not anything that all of a sudden you wake up one morning and that happens. It's something that happens over time in your families and in your individual lives. Some of us know that we do need to be rescued. And we recognize the fact and say, God, I know that I need to be saved. I know that I need you to work in my life. God, I don't think you understand my situation. I don't think you understand what's going on in my life right now. God, I'm pretty messed up. The things that my kids are doing are pretty jacked up. God, as soon as I take from where I'm at right now, let me get back to this place. And as soon as I get here, now I know that I can start talking to God. We do that in our lives. Do you know where God wants to meet you? Do you know where God wants to rescue you? Right here. Right where you're at right now. Not on your own. He doesn't even need your help. He just wants you to love Him. He wants to be in a relationship with you. He wants to care for you. And there's nothing that you can do of your own accord to justify that experience. There is nothing that you can do to say, okay, I know that I want to be here. God, let's walk hand in hand and we're going to do this together. No. He just wants you to accept the fact that He loves you. And He wants to do it for you in your life. Some of you are saying this morning, and I know because I've been talking to you, and you know that God exists, and you know that He is your rescuer. But does this sound familiar? I don't see God. I don't feel God. I feel distant from God. And if I asked you right now to raise your hand if you have or if you are currently feeling distant from God, every single hand in this room would go up. Because at times in our lives, we've all felt that way. At times, we've been able to identify with the Israelites where we are leaning on the promises of God that He is going to do something, but we feel so distant, we feel so far away that I don't know if this is ever going to happen. I feel really discouraged. I feel like that kid crying back there. I don't know if this is ever going to work the way that I think that it's going to work. This is where the Israelites were in Exodus chapter 1. They were experiencing a rough and a trying times in their lives, and things are about to take a turn for the worse. So let's continue in chapter 1, verse 8. And it says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt, a new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph and all the great things that he and his family had done for the people of Egypt. And he said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many, and they're too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.' Therefore they set taskmasters over to afflict them with heavy burdens. And they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more that they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad." That's that first promise, that God would multiply them into a great nation. "And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves." How many of you, when you look back at this week, when you look at these last 6-7 days since last Sunday, how many of you had a hard week? How many of you had an oppressive week? A difficult week? I did. And I'll be honest with you, I had a hard week. A difficult week. Janet and I received some news. My wife Janet and I received some news on Monday. Some bad news. And it was to the point where we thought that it was almost overwhelming. And then on Tuesday, we woke up and we received some other bad news, not even related to the first. Then we went to bed. Then we woke up on Wednesday and we received some more bad news. None of these things were related. It just felt like they were piling and piling and piling on top of each other. And it almost became a joke at that point, because we woke up on Thursday and we're like, okay, what's going to happen today? What's going to go wrong in our lives today? This week, Janet and I, my wife, we needed rescued. We needed saved. I wanted God to show up in a miraculous way. I wanted Him to defeat my enemies. I wanted Him to overpower them. And I wanted Him to work in a way so I could take the victory. So I could show them that I was in control. Things didn't work out the way that I wanted them to. Throughout this entire week, as I was doing my devotions, as I was reading scriptures, God kept saying something to me the whole week. And I hate it when God gives me experiences in my life to use as illustrations, because I don't want them, but I do feel like I need to share them with you. God was saying to me this entire week, I hear your cries. I want you to trust me to see you through this. I hear your cries. Trust me to see you through this. I didn't see what God was doing this last week. In my narrow focus, I was only able to see a little piece of the pie. And I got frustrated. And I got discouraged. And I got despaired. But all these things that seemingly just kept popping up and kept popping up the entire week. How many of you guys like puzzles? Okay. Now, for you parents in the room, for Sarah in the back, I'm not talking about these 9-piece puzzles that your toddlers do, or these little 27-piece ones. Like these 5,000 piece puzzles, these 10,000 piece puzzles, these huge, massive ones. Well, the first thing that I do when I put together a puzzle is I take all the pieces out of the box and I dump them out. And then I turn them all right side up. And I start to look for the corners. And I start to look for all those edge pieces. And then I take one small individual piece, or maybe a couple of them. I'll pick them up. And I'll look at them and I'll say, okay, this little tiny piece, in this 10,000 piece puzzle, when I look at the box, where does it fit in? This little tiny piece, what significance, what relevance does this one little piece have to the giant puzzle? In our own lives, we have a puzzle that we're working on too. And God is putting together the pieces of our life. The problem is, the thing that we need to understand, the thing that we need to come to realize is that we don't have the cover of that box. But God does. That He sees the entire picture. He sees those puzzle pieces, your life, my life, our lives. And He sees the way that they all go together. And He sees from a bird's eye view this entire thing that we call life. The thing that amazes me, just blows me away, is the fact that God is constantly putting puzzle pieces together. That He's putting together sections of that puzzle. There's a little face in the puzzle. He's putting it together, an object. He's forming it. And even though we're concentrating on this part of the puzzle up here, God is at work putting together other puzzle pieces in our life. And He's working, sometimes even unbeknownst to us. In the lives of the Israelites, at the end of chapter 1 of Exodus, they are being overwhelmed by Pharaoh. They are being overwhelmed by the people of Egypt. They are being oppressed. They are being held as slaves. And they remember the fact that God said, I'm going to lead you out of here. And they don't know that God is at work on that puzzle. That God is at work behind the scenes. And He's raising up the next leader. The person who is going to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And so while they're focusing on their lives up here and saying, man, life sucks, God is working behind the scenes in the beginning verses of Exodus chapter 2. So go ahead and turn there. Exodus chapter 2, looking at verse 1. And it says, now a man from the house of Levi went and he took his wife as his wife, a Levite woman. Instead of took, Ryan, I believe that means he asked and he coerced her and he didn't just take her as his wife. Okay, so just if you don't get any bad ideas there. The woman conceived and she bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, meaning he was healthy. This word right here for fine child is the same at the beginning of Genesis 1 when God created the earth and He said, and it was good. That's the same word that we're looking at here. You saw that his mother saw that he was a fine child, that he was a good child, that it was morally right. She hid him for 3 months. According, when you think about Matthias, you think about hiding a child for 3 months and keeping them quiet and saying, okay, you can't be loud right now, okay? I just need you to be quiet. Well, eventually she got to the point where she could no longer hide him, verse 3. And she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed him among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him, just watching over him. And now the daughter of Pharaoh, the king of Israel, came down to the bathe at the river. While her young women, they walked beside the river. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the child went and called the child's mother. This is Moses' mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him, and when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called him Moses, because that's the Hebrew word that sounds Moshe. It means to draw out, basically to pull out of the water. So what's going on? In these first 10 verses of the second chapter of Exodus, what's going on right here? Well, Israel was growing big. They were multiplying greatly in the land of Egypt. And all the Egyptians and the Pharaoh, they were scared as to how big the Israelite nation were getting. So what they did was, as soon as a child was born, they would say, okay, is it a boy or a girl? And if it was a girl, they would allow that child to live. But if it was a boy, the midwives were under orders to kill all of the boys. Every single boy Israelite that was born had to be killed. And so Moses' mother, here in this story, she doesn't want him to be killed, so she hides him. And through God's watching over him, Moses is taken care of. But eventually he becomes too big. So she takes him and she puts him in a little basket and she coats it with some stuff to keep it waterproof, and she puts him in the river. So he can be watched over. It's easier to hide him there than it is back at their home where they were searching for all of the children. Well, eventually the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, he comes down, his daughter comes down the river to bathe, and she hears a baby crying. And she says, go find out what's going on to my servants. And they bring him over, and she says, man, this is a Hebrew child. I can't nurse him, so I need to get one of the Hebrew women to nurse him. And who does she get? She gets Moses' mom. So not only is Moses being taken care of, he's going to be raised, and he's not going to have any more fear of being killed. His mom is getting paid to raise him. By the same person who has said, all Israelite boys must be killed. That he's being raised by that man's daughter. And he's being watched over, and he's being taken care of. So before Moses was even born, he was born to two Levites. To two people who were very upstanding in the community of Israel. In his birth, he was hidden, and God allowed him to be hidden so he wasn't seen by the Egyptians who were trying to kill all the baby boys. In his childhood, he was raised by his own mom. And then later, he was actually raised in the Pharaoh's own courts. He was raised alongside other Egyptian boys and girls, and raised right underneath the nose of Pharaoh himself. And then Moses did something, and he had to flee from Egypt. And God watched over him as he fled into the desert. What's going on? God is putting together the pieces of the puzzle. God is providing the way for the people of Israel to be rescued, to be saved, to take up the second half of that promise that I will lead you back out to your land. In our own lives, sometimes we don't see the work that God is doing as well. That we're too focused on this part of the puzzle, that we don't see the way that the Lord is doing some other work. In the Israelites' lives, they were too focused on what was going on to see the fact that God was raising up Moses and working miraculously in his life so that he could lead his people. And the people of Israel, they were crying out to God, and they were asking him, God, what's going on? Why are you not taking care of us? And they were asking the same questions that we ask in our lives today. And I've written down some of these questions that either I've had or that I've talked to you about. And I'm pretty sure as I start to read down through some of these questions that you're able to identify with one, with two, with three, with four, possibly quite a few of the questions on this list. God, where were you when my loved one died? God, where were you when I lost my job? God, where were you when I got cancer? God, where were you when that person was treating me that way? God, where were you when I was praying to you and I didn't see you or I didn't hear you answering my prayers? God, where were you when my house wouldn't sell? God, where were you when my kids are fighting or they're misbehaving? God, where are you when my spouse, they feel so distant from me? God, why am I single? God, why am I depressed? God, why am I unable to have children? God, why do I feel so stuck in my job? God, why do I sin? even though I don't want to. God, where are you in my life? Those are the same questions that the people of Israel were asking in Exodus chapters 1 and 2. But look what happens in 2:23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel, they groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. They asked those questions in their life. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. God saw the people of Israel. God knew. And God knew. That same phrase that's been running over in my life this week is the same phrase that God was giving to the people of Israel at this time. I hear your cries. Trust me to see you through this. God sees your life. God sees your cries. And He knows that you are groaning. He knows that you are crying. He knows that you need rescued, and He knows that you need saved. But the awesome thing about God is He just doesn't leave us there. When He sees that we need rescue, when He sees that we need saved, He doesn't only say, man, I'm sorry about that. You're kind of on your own. No. He provides the way. He provides the mean for our rescue, for us to be saved. Look at Romans chapter 5 real quick. Romans 5, verse 6. If you have your Bibles, if you just want to open up to it. Romans 5, beginning at verse 6. And it says, for while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good reason one would dare even to die. But God shows His love for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have now been justified by His blood, how much more shall we be saved from Him, or by Him from the wrath of God? For if while we were enemies we were reconciled to God by the death of His Son, much more, now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by His life. More than that, we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. If you look back at those verses, it says what? While we were weak, He sent His Son to die for us. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. While we were enemies, He reconciled, He returned, He restored us to Him. While we were focused on this part of the puzzle, He was already working on this part of the puzzle and starting to put things together in our lives and the love that He showed to us in the death of His Son. The Creator of the entire universe. The one who set the sun and the moon and the stars, the one who separated the light from the darkness, the one who separated the land from the water, the one who created all the animals and created the plants and ultimately humankind. He knows. Just like at the end of chapter 2 in Exodus, He hears us. He hears our cries, and He's saying to us right now, trust me to see you through this. Frederick Oler, who's a chaplain, a teacher, and a pastor, he wrote this poem. And the title of it is Awful. Not awful as in bad, but full of awe. And he said, I love these words, and I pray that it is your prayer this morning. Great and holy God, awe and reverence, fear and trembling, they don't come easily to us. For we are not Old Testament Jews, or Moses, or mystics, or sensitive enough. Forgive us for slouching into your presence with little expectation and less awe than we would eagerly give a visiting dignitary. We need neither Jehovah nor a buddy. We don't need the great and powerful Oz nor the man upstairs. Help us to want what we need, and that is you, God. And may the altar of our hearts tremble with delight at your visitation. Amen. This morning, as we look at Exodus chapters 1 and 2, God is saying to you, God is saying to me, God is saying to us, I hear your cries. Trust me to see you through this. Let's pray.